Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Poe, and today I am bringing you week 15 of my 2019 reads. This was a great reading week. I managed to read 4 books that spanned fairly different genres and also fairly different ratings for me. I think I'm still a little wary of what ratings I'm giving things. After the beginning of this year I had so many 5-star reads, but now it seems like I'm settling into a much more normal rating distribution, which makes me feel better about how I'm rating things. The first book that I finished this week was The Wonder Engine by Kingfisher, which was the sequel or second half of the story, started in The Clockwork Boys by Kingfisher. This is a book that Sush, my husband, read out loud to me, and I always enjoy having him read things out loud to me. It adds a lot of interesting dynamics when we get to discuss as we go. So I think this book was really a nice continuation from the first. It explored a lot of the characters in more depth, went into their backgrounds. I loved learning more about Slate's history as a forger and what she kind of got up to in Anicut City the first time around. I loved learning more about Caliban's history as a paladin and what that sort of involved. I think though that my absolute favorite part of this book was the exploration of the gnolls. I adored Grimehug, and I really loved learning about the gnoll culture, the complex use of language where physical symbols through whiskers and ear positions added complexity to the meaning of each word. I loved learning about their caste system and how they each saw it. I loved learning about how gender works in their societies. So I thought that was just a very cool sort of world building that really added to the story for me. I think that the pacing of this book was also really good. It had a lot of different peaks in the story and a lot of different adventures that the characters were going on. I think especially the sort of final boss battle was a really engaging battle that I felt totally engrossed in. So I very much enjoyed those aspects of the story. I think though that the relationship between Slate and Caliban was something that didn't quite work for me. I loved the idea of the relationship, but in actuality I felt like they were kind of maybe not the healthiest in the way that they interacted. I felt that sometimes that could be even a little bit verging on emotional abuse and verbal abuse. So that I wasn't such a huge fan of, and it definitely towards the end really brought down the story for me. But overall, I did enjoy the action, the adventure, the world building. I enjoyed the characters. I enjoyed learning about them and seeing them resolve this big epic quest. So I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I finished Hunger by Roxane Gay. This is a memoir of Gay's life, and I listened to the audiobook format, which I highly recommend. I really loved listening to her tell her memoir in her own voice. I think this was an incredibly powerful story. I was completely touched and moved by the whole story, even though it contained a lot of very difficult content. There are major trigger warnings in this for things like rape and abuse and eating disorders and just sort of a lot of things revolving around depression and shame. So it contains a lot of very heavy content, but I felt that the way that Gay presented everything was so eminently relatable. You felt connected to her, you felt like you understood her, even as she was going through these incredibly traumatizing events and as she was dealing with a lot of bad life choices and kind of inner turmoil. So I was thoroughly engaged in this book. I really, really loved it, and I'm going to do a separate review later this week talking more in depth about what she covers and why I think it was such a powerful memoir. Overall, I gave this 5 out of 5 stars, and I really look forward to picking up more by Roxane Gay. Next, I finished Love is Deeper Than Distance by Edera, and this is a poetry collection put out by Fernwood Press. I've mentioned their channel before, but I will link it below. Fernwood Press is a small publisher that is nonprofit based in Oregon, I believe, and I really enjoyed this collection that they've put out. Edera writes in this collection about the experience of losing her husband. Her husband developed ALS and dementia and passed away. And these poems explore her love for her husband, the grief and frustration and just all those bundled emotions that she felt as he was deteriorating and losing his kind of cognitive functioning and passed away, and just her experience recovering from that. So these poems were very emotionally pulling, and I thought that it was such a good experience to see perspective into what that must be like to watch your partner deteriorate and lose who they are, and to be there and try to support them while also mourning that loss of your partner. These poems were so moving. I think I cried throughout probably like 75% of them. They were just so touching and so intense. I think that Edera also has a very, very good way with words. I loved the metaphors that she used and the way that she phrased things and her word choices. It completely drew me into the story. So I loved these poems. I thought they were very, very touching, and it provided good insight into what the emotional state of somebody going through that kind of experience would be. The only thing that I wasn't as big on was, again, I couldn't sometimes find the rhythm in the poems. So even though the word choice and the phrasings were amazing, the structure of the poems sometimes was harder for me to get into. But I overall just loved this poetry collection, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Lastly, I finished Aquicorn Cove by Katie O'Neill. This is a comic book designed for young readers that is actually on the shortlist for the BooktubeSFF Awards, which I will link the Goodreads to below. And my husband got me this as a gift since he knew I wanted to read as many books as possible on the shortlist so that I can vote when that comes up. This comic book focuses on a young girl, Lana, who has gone with her father to an island where her aunt lives that has experienced a recent tropical storm, and they're trying to help clean up and rebuild things. The artwork in this comic is spectacular. I think that's just out of this world, so beautiful. The colors are these gorgeous coral pastels, the scenery of the ocean and the islands and the fish and the coral. It's just absolutely lovely. I really adored the art, and it has these great soft round lines. I could look at those pictures forever. I think the characters were also really interesting. Lana had lost her mother somewhat recently before the story takes place, and she and her father are dealing with grief from that, and they're dealing with it in different ways. Her father experiences a lot of anxiety and wants to protect Lana. Lana kind of withdraws into herself and doesn't know how to connect or ask for what she needs. So that's a really interesting dynamic between the two of them. The aunt is also a really interesting character. She's very strong, very directed, very helpful, but she has her own weaknesses and her own short-sightedness. So I think the characters were also very strong in this book. However, I was not a huge fan of the storyline itself. It has a big focus on environmental issues, global warming, pollution of the oceans, the dying of coral, and I felt sometimes that the story was a little heavy-handed in pushing these concerns and themes, and that the storyline itself wasn't as developed as it could have been. It was just kind of a little short and abrupt and basically heavy-handed in its message. So I think maybe for young readers that might work a little bit better, but as an adult reader, I could have almost just really enjoyed looking through the pictures without reading the words, and gotten a lot more out of this comic. The message just, even if I agree with the message, it just felt very heavy-handed. So overall, especially because of the art, I gave this comic book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Okay, that wraps up week 15 for me. I hope you guys have had a great reading week as well. If you've read any of these books, please do leave me a comment below and I will talk to you next week.